Beautiful. Now we're good to go. Next up, we have Jennifer WalshMarr presenting What the Language Lacuna Leaves Room for Pragmatic Approaches in Engineering Communication Pedagogy.
Thank you, and thank you for joining me today. I'm joining you from the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, currently known as North Vancouver. And this is part of my dissertation research. I am an English for specific academic purposes instructor at UBC Vantage College, working with first-year international students developing in engineering. And throughout my career, my goal has been to make language accessible and connect it to purpose. I engage in a range of research activities working to connect the theoretical to pedagogy. And however, while my day job is EAP and my focus defaults to language, this study is not EAP specific. It's situated within an undergraduate School of Engineering with a large international student population, most of whom prove their English language proficiency by tests such as the IELTS. So in this study, I'm focusing on faculty who teach engineering communication courses. They are situated at the chalk face between students and the institutions that set criteria and seek accreditation from Engineers Canada. So similar to language and context being mutually constitutive, the layers of the university have impact on one another as well. In previous contexts, I've worked with and interviewed some faculty members who have expressed a range of strongly held opinions on internationalization, student readiness, and their roles and responsibilities, including, I'm not teaching English as a second language, or that they feel that there's a moral obligation that if the university admits students, that we have to tell them that there's an English threshold for success. It should be a realistic threshold. Or also that the university doesn't necessarily train or support faculty members supporting students in this dilemma. There's also the philosophical argument that it's not academics' purpose to prepare students for work, but in engineering it is. I'm also situating this within an engineering as it typically has 20 to 25 or more % international, multilingual international student enrollment. So at the entry point, we have international multilingual students admitted with an IELTS 6.5 proficiency score, going against IELTS recommendations, probably to be competitive with other institutions. An IELTS 6.5 says English study needed for linguistically demanding courses. And I suggest that writing and general communication courses are, in fact, linguistically demanding. At an endpoint, our program accreditation criteria, including specifically the ability to communicate complex engineering concepts, a focus on communication. So between these 2 points are engineering communication courses and the instructors who deliver them. And please note that I'm not suggesting that higher IELTS scores is the perfect solution. What I'm interested in are the implications of this, not just on students, but on the faculty who receive them. It seems to me that there's a mismatch between what the profession demands and what the university offers. So my research questions are, how do instructors interpret their responsibilities and resources in engineering courses in relation to English language proficiency, admission requirements? And second question, and how do instructors' pedagogic values manifest in their student-facing resources? The communication is a big deal in engineering, more than that professional practicing engineers are really emphatic about the importance of developing those communication skills. 64% of their work time is spent communicating, and instruction needs to be discipline specific, but it typically isn't. It often is generic or outsourced. There's not much discussion on developing English language skills concomitant with disciplinary communication. And again, this is despite the fact that more than a quarter of students at major engineering schools in Canada are international and multilingual students. So we can situate this in the context of policies. And language policies and practice are typically informed by language ideologies. Language policies have a regulating power over language use and interaction with communities, workplaces, and schools. They regulate participation. Standardized testing is typically used for regulating this participation. So when an institution admits a student, we're essentially giving a green light or saying that you're ready to go and that you're deemed ready to study in the field. And a key way that this is regulated is through language proficiency tests, such as the IELTS, which is the most common one used in my study site. So it's internationally recognized, and it's a representative of the global testing culture. And this is representative of labor mobility and ready, transportable and interpretation of these credentials. It's also representative, as mentioned earlier in Jeff's plenary this morning, of increased commodification of proficiency test scores in this competitive educational marketplace, if not the commodification of English itself. So I situated my study at a major research university with 2 campuses, and ethics were required for both U of T and for my research site. And I had 6 participants, 3 people who identified as women, 3 who identified as men, 2 were tenured, 2 were lecturers, and 2 were sessional instructors. For one instructor, this was the first time they were teaching the course. Another had been at it for more than 15 years. And the rest of them averaged 3 to 6 years of teaching experience in these particular engineering communication courses. I engaged in semi-structured interviews where I asked about their teaching context, their experiences, the resources, familiarity with the graduate attributes as the end point, and the IELTS proficiency descriptors as the entrance point. In my data analysis, I am employing both critical and positive discourse analysis for my interview and artifact content. So a first pass looking at instructors' statements and how those are indicative of their values. And then getting deeper into a second pass looking at and using a process engineering model. So the context of their teaching situation, the input in terms of language proficiency and familiarity with descriptors, the processes of their actual pedagogy and teaching and the resources that they draw from, and then their representation of the student proficiency and their output. And when looking at the processes, I'm looking at their teaching artifacts and doing a close linguistic analysis of representations of rationale, of inclusive positioning and specificity in their pedagogy. Critical discourse analysis is concerned with how ideologies, including those related to power and belonging, are manifest in language. Language choices representing understandings and beliefs and relating language to context. It's very useful in terms of interrogating language ideologies. In the context of my study, I research how instructors represent their position in the academy, their interpretation of their agency and responsibility for pedagogic decisions, and their familiarity with the language proficiency requirements, and how these factors interact and influence their work. I analyze participants' language choices in representing these ideas, both in their interviews about teaching and students, and in their artifacts for teaching to the students. I then engage in positive discourse analysis to move past critique. So positive discourse analysis is essentially what seems to be working and what the components and the context of those practices are. It's used to amplify progressive discourses and better understand semiotic mechanisms of resistance and empowerment in order to increase their positive impact on society, which ultimately I think pedagogy and teaching is for. And I use this as positive discourse analysis is instructive, what to actually do. So my findings and implications, it may come to no surprise to those of us in the language field that there isn't a lot of attention paid to language. There is a gap or a lacuna, but there is also more. The major themes in my finding when discussing language, if at all, is seen as a distinct skill divorced from disciplinary usage. Previous tests and courses should have prepared students for their engineering communication demands. But the faculty took up meaningful instruction nonetheless in both pragmatic, principled, and sometimes even ambitious ways. I'll share some data points with you next to highlight these findings. But first, the gap or lacuna in engagement with language. These comments and gaps in knowledge and support are concerning, but not terribly surprising. Only 2 of my 6 participants had any familiarity with IELTS proficiency at all. They often stipulated error-free or perfect performance expected in any of their assignments. There was little to no attention to language within the course or within the pedagogy and the support. And if there was support, it was outsourced to apps, to writing centers, to tutors, or to generative AI. When discussing the language familiarity or asking about it, they said that they'd never really thought about any of these requirements because there was an assumed minimum standard that students had to get into the university. Or also that they're not aware of any attention to English proficiency or support for students. And somewhat ironically, this participant was charged with EDI responsibilities within this campus. There was an expectation of gatekeeping that whatever students needed to be successful in this particular course would have been covered in first-year courses. And they even referred to first-year courses as a filter or a screen of language proficiency and communication skills before they entered this particular second-year course. And yet, despite not engaging much with language itself and preparing students for proficient communication, instructors are stretching their practices beyond this initial realm of responsibility specific in the graduate attributes of communication skills. They're also engaging in individual and teamwork, professionalism, and the impact of engineering on society and the environment. They're expanding their curriculum. They're attending to gender bias within engineering, looking at cases of discrimination and harassment, and even sometimes linguistic representation in discrete contexts. They're also expanding the curricula to engage with empathy with the international student experience. So talking about the journey to university, how some students may be navigating culture shock and the considerable expense of international tuition and parental pressure and that paradox of pressure and yet isolation. They're also doing really strong work and attempts at decolonization. So a lot of work on awareness and acknowledgement of traditional territories, and some assignments that are focused on engaging with Indigenous community consultation in the context of engineering work. To focus on that decolonizing pedagogy, there's looking at what engineers have to know before they consult with any Indigenous community. So looking at language in that context, what language is not value neutral, there's meaning behind it, and what it means to be an engineer in the Canadian colonial context. So some real critical work in that regard. And yet there's outsourcing, this pattern that I noticed was one of the biggest trends when actually talking about language. And there's some
Sorry,
irony here.
Jennifer,
Yes?
for interrupting you. You only have, you've gone over your time, so we
My
won't
time
have
says 13 minutes. I had 15. We started a bit late, so.
Yeah, we won't have time for questions, but just
Okay.
I wrote in the chat.
Okay, I thank you. So one of the biggest trends was about outsourcing. So schools of engineering outsource their engineering communication to non-engineers, and those communications instructors outsource language support to, and yet multilingual international students want concrete suggestions and language supports to be supported within their courses, rather than asking students to rely on external campus support services. So I think it's important for universities, both admissions departments and instructional faculty, to realize that language test score is not a clear representation of a student's full repertoire and proficiency, nor is it representative necessarily of their academic literacy or their academic success. UK universities require postgraduate teaching qualifications to teach in higher education, and very recent scholarship recommends embedding what they call language assessment literacy in those higher education teaching qualifications. There are implications for both policy and pedagogy, that language assessment literacy for both admissions and the faculty, a more comprehensive tracking of students beyond just their GPA and graduation requirements, but support and collaboration within the School of Engineering, and this requires some infrastructure support. In terms of the pedagogy, engaging in more linguistically responsive instruction, making the implicit expectations explicit, deconstructing of authentic texts, and making discipline-specific support within the School of Engineering. So thank you, and that is the end of my presentation.